Hey everybody, Roger Courville here, and I'm sitting here on the fly. I decided to have a conversation because we were talking about story, and we thought we might just turn on a recorder and say this is useful for a lot of people that we've run into. Welcome. Tell me who you are and what it is that you do.
Sure. I am Michael Santarcangelo. I'm known by a lot of people as Catalyst or the Security Catalyst. And what I do is evolving, but I take friction out of communication that gives us the opportunity to connect people to value, which is where we got started in terms of thinking about their stories. And ultimately, by learning these building blocks, I work with individuals and organizations to achieve higher levels of performance.
Sweet. So, you know what, Michael? It hadn't been too long, and I'm already at a place where our relationship, in a sense, online has evolved to the place where I don't even remember exactly where it started. But let me say this. So one of the places that I think I started to sense a kinship was when you're talking about people at the people level and telling one story. So your background being technical, and mine decidedly being non-technical, like more communications, pro services, sales and marketing, and that kind of thing. Yet, in a sense, we're talking about human beings and telling a story and finding how and where we create value and how we connect with other people. And I'm just like, that's a conversation that I know a lot of people might want to eavesdrop on. So let me ask you this: give us the 50,000-foot flyby of your background. How did you go from being security guy to talking about communications and agency and real people being real people?
Yeah, the interesting thing to it is it's almost like, how did I end up being a security guy, and then how did I get back to my roots? So my degree, and it was one of those things like, sometimes you just make the right choices in life. I have a degree in human ecology. And so it's a bachelor's of science, and it's a multidisciplinary approach that at its basic level says, the world has an impact on people, and people have an impact on the world. Let's go figure out how to measure that and understand that. My favorite classes were ethnography, sociology, field studies, but then we'd had to back that up with a rigorous economics background and statistics. And so the idea behind it was that you could create a policy or implement a solution, and we could tell you how it would impact people. Not just by giving you the model, we learned how to tell the story. And so that became really important to me, and I was just fascinated with that type of stuff.
Interesting.
I got into security just by accident, because I asked questions.
Well, so I married a computer engineer, and so who happens to be one of those radical introverts who happens to also be quite good at speaking publicly. Right? Would rather do that in front of 50 or 500 people than do it one-on-one with a total stranger that just happened to enter her space. But I guess with regard to what we were just talking about, and what I think might be useful here would be to say, what would you teach someone about how to live life or connect with others and be authentic and have this real connection with people, not get lonely or disconnected or uncomfortable once technology is involved?
It's interesting. Here's a couple of thoughts that popped into my head. Kind of like a lot of people, like I think in flashes. I can remember we share a common lineage with the National Speakers Association. I can remember some number of years ago attending. They did a humor lab, so I was one of the 80 people. Now, keep in mind, right? And for the people that maybe join us on this, when you're a professional speaker and you're around other professional speakers, it should be like, yeah, rah rah. Except for this lab was, we're going to draw names out of a hat, and if we draw your name, you're going to get up in front of everybody else, and you're going to give a prepared snippet. So, of course...
Wait, pause. Was that January a couple years ago in Las Vegas?
No, this was held in Scottsdale.
Okay.
It was May.
Okay.
It was...
So I was at a different humor lab, but keep going.
Yeah, this was... So what was interesting about it was, so there's 80 people in the room, and what this has to do with living authentically and stuff, I learned a lot at this particular juncture. They picked my name out of the hat. Now, I actually was out of the room. I wasn't trying to escape it. I had a headache. I was in the search for some Advil or something, and I come back in, and somebody goes, "Oh, it's Michael. He's back. Let him go." And the guy running the lab said, "Nope, we drew his name. He missed his opportunity. We're going to do it again." And at that point, you realize collectively, 80 other people around the room went, "Oh no, that means they can call me." no, let him go. And so people start to, no, let him try. And so there's this like 5 minutes of tension. And I'm sitting there going, nope, I missed my chance. I apologize. You're right. And they pushed me up to the front of the room. And so I shared a story about my family and spam and all sorts of other stuff. And something really remarkable happened. I had really good connections with people afterwards. There were some remarkable people in that audience that came up to me afterwards and said, hey, may I offer you some feedback? But I knew who these people were. It wasn't like, you could say anything you want. I'm taking notes. And then people would pass me notes, and then people would chat with me, and then I built friendships from it. So the first thing I learned was even speakers are terrified of speaking in front of especially other speakers, but there's no reason to be. Because, what I've learned going on and teaching people how to communicate, so not so much about the speaking, but the communication side is, we're always afraid of that. And the better thing to do is just get up and go through it. And people will relate to that, especially if you're not trying to hide it. Just go through it.
Yeah.
And that was one of the first 3 really powerful things that I learned. So even when the technology's involved, right? I mean, I think what you and I are doing right now is a perfect example. Hey, this is a good conversation. We should record it. Cool. We're not scripted. This is going to be authentic. I think that starts to break through. We don't have to be perfect. We can stutter. We can say an It always drives me nuts when people want to judge your effectiveness based on how many ums and ahs you uttered. I admit they can be distracting, but if your substance is good, I'll take that over a polished presentation.
So note both for you and for our audience, scientists refer to that, or linguists refer to those as disfluencies. And there are actually 2 separate studies that show that disfluencies improve comprehension on behalf of the learner, because usually that or that pause or that kind of thing that Toastmasters is trying to drum out of you is sending a signal, is what they presume, is sending a signal to you that something's coming. Now, you're exactly right. If it is a distraction, then it's not helping, it's hurting conversation. But the completely whitewashed, no ums, ahs, so's, ands, ifs, or buts kind of Toastmasters response, it may not entirely be supported with some of that science. Now, let me draw a quick delineation. Conversation doesn't look at it in the same way as presentation.
That's a great point.
Right? Because and in fact, when you and I are conversing, I probably don't even notice when you say right? And that, in fact, when I'm working with presenters, that's one of the things that I encourage them to do. I say authenticity trumps technique every time. And, in my world where that's a lot of helping people move presentations online, feel comfortable saying, how do I, because their most frequent question is always, how do I engage an audience that I can't see? I say the first thing we got to do is get beyond technology. It doesn't mean that we don't have to use the technology, but there's one. But the goal is humanity, and you're not going to get there if you're not focused on the person on the other side of the technology. Yep. Right? You're going to sound distracted or uncomfortable or something like that. Interestingly, one of the things that I've observed is that you can start to tell how comfortable someone is based on the language that they use. So I don't know where the quote came from, but I heard someone once say, people don't think of it as technology if they grew up with it.
Oh, yeah.
So last week, literally, I'm sitting down with a friend of mine, a guy, and he was asking for some assistance, and talked about setting down some project time for Twitter, using Twitter and social media. And I think I need to plan out and carve out some time each day. And I said, I would first start with your language and then start with your approach before you got to Twitter. And he says, well, what do you mean? And I said, let me ask you this. If you're going to call your wife, do you say, I'm going to go do phone? No, we don't do Twitter. We talk to people. I'm in a neighborhood. I'm walking around this neighborhood, and I'm talking to the people that come by. And sometimes I purposefully go up to somebody because I want to talk to them, and sometimes they purposefully come up to me because they want to talk to me. I call this is what I've trademarked called neighborhood switching, right?
Yeah,
Which is
I love
which
Great concept.
which is okay. I'm in a different neighborhood now. Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever it happens to be, Baidu. But the question is, what am I going to do in that neighborhood? Am I going to sit around with my thumb up my yin yang, or am I going to talk to people, or let them talk to me, and that kind of thing? Because the problem is, the instant I think about doing Twitter, that I'm contributing to the noise that is the problem. We're only contributing to the problem that is what we're trying to avoid. That's why we feel disconnected. We don't need more noise in the world. Your potential prospects, customers, audience members, employees, learners on the other end of your training session don't need more frickin' noise.
Well, there's a word you and I use in common that I think connects to it, and this would be like the second of my experiences, and it happened just this week. My son and I were going out for a walk, and there's new couples moving into the area. We're in an area that's going through a bunch of expansion, and it's essentially springtime. It's not essentially, it's springtime here on the beach. And so we see people, and I smile, and I wave, and I say, hey. And that's it. I just, hey, how's it going tonight? But you can tell sometimes that people want to engage, because what do we seek? We seek connection, right? You and I both use that word. I talk about how do we connect people to value, their own and the value of others. And you look at connection and how are we connecting with people, because as humans, we crave that connection. So what you just pointed out is, I love the idea of calling it a neighborhood. And if you're cool with that, I'm probably going to borrow that, at least on my website, because I like that idea of a neighborhood. I'm happy to admit I post out links and I automate some of the stuff on Twitter, but I always invite people to engage with me. Like, I don't like the concept of followers. I've always said, yeah, just engage, and hit me with something, I'll hit you back. You and I do this frequently.
And automation isn't wrong. I do the same thing. It's a part of this time shifting, the ability to time shift, about saying, in a sense, when am I in a neighborhood, right? That doesn't mean I don't ever post stuff, but but I think it comes from a different place that starts in the heart, which is, am I sharing something that is of value? It's something of value to me. It's something of value to somebody else. Or it's, because this is that tension that we were talking about before we hopped on the call, right? The marketing tension is, it's all about the audience, right? I need to put something out there that they find interesting and attractive so that they respond. The flip side is, what do I want? What do I find interesting? What is my art to? And I love the way Seth Godin actually talks about that, which is, how do I see the world? How do I connect the dots in a unique way? Is in fact what the world is craving. The question for those of us who need to be purposeful is, how are we going to go purposefully connect, knowing that underneath we all have that sense or craving of connection. Now, that doesn't mean that we all sign a business deal. It doesn't mean we all become best friends. We might, go another 10 minutes and you decide I'm a complete idiot, I'm never talking to that guy again. But if somebody doesn't have the courage to walk up to somebody else and say hello, online or offline, we're gonna live in a lonely world.
Yeah, and I think what happens is, a lot of times we're so afraid of what somebody else thinks, but it's kind of like, I think sometimes we're more afraid of what we think, right? And the other person acts as just a mirror. And so, when we start looking at value in stories and stuff, there's some interesting trends that I see, right? If you don't respect yourself, it's hard to respect somebody else. If you don't understand your value, it's hard to recognize the value in someone or something else. And so a lot of people won't do something because, well, that could be embarrassing. So the third thing that popped in my mind when you asked me about it was, I'll tell you where I was, in College Town in Arizona. I was walking down, a buddy of mine and I finished up a speaking gig, and we went, there's a dueling piano bar there, at least there was at the time. And we came out, and we were talking, and to be clear, I don't even know if I had a drink. So there was no alcohol involved in this. But, we were just kind of like singing and dancing in the street, and we were talking, and I can remember there was a small group of us, and somebody was like, aren't people going to look at you? And I'm like, yeah, and they don't know who I am, and they're never going to care. And I was like, guys, and it was like one of those, yeah, they don't care. Like, yeah, why do I care? And it was this really good beginning of realizing that, we've actually got to be comfortable in ourselves. I didn't hurt anybody. I didn't cause any property damage. I was perhaps singing off key, but not really loud. I was happy. I was having a good time. And I started to realize that a lot of times we try so hard to rigidly conform, but what we're conforming to is an illusion. And then we lock ourselves in that. And so, when we start talking about technology or otherwise, the technology is a means, not only to shift the time, but to shift the place. It used to be, for you and I to talk like this, we literally have to be face to face. We don't have to anymore.
Right.
We're on opposite coasts.
Yes, and now we can, in a sense, have the same dialogue as if we're sitting in the same table at a Starbucks. May come to something that you said that I think is maps to my view of the world, which is this post-information age thing that I'm calling the connectorship age. One of the challenges is that if the world is moving to a place where content is no longer a function of scarcity but abundance, we have huge amount of noise, right? We've been hearing that from the media world and how many advertisements we see every day, all that kind of stuff. But the same is actually true with useful content. It's content, and your expertise is no longer a thing of scarcity.
Correct.
Your perspective and your angle and the way that you see the world uniquely is the thing that is scarce and has the because of your time and that you have the ability to create value with. But I think one of the things that you said made me think of one of the critical shifts that is occurring that is going to either spell doom or opportunity for somebody. Industrialization was marked by at its extreme Six Sigma. Right? For those of you who are not in the manufacturing or engineering world, that's how do we get to 99.999% efficiency and drive friction and labor and variance and all of that out of the equation, which is how we achieved scale. Right? Industrialization was all about scale. Any color's great as long as it's black, was Henry Ford's famous quote. Right? Well, the challenge is that industrialization first was marked by interchangeable parts. And then it became marked by interchangeable people, which we still see to this day in a job description or the way someone structures something. In fact, one of the most revolutionary books that I read in 1989 or something was called The E-Myth, Michael Gerber, right? But interestingly, I spent a lot of years going, that's the ideal, when in fact what he was advocating was the interchangeable person model. Right? Create this whole thing, you go build this whole thing, you plug people into job descriptions, and that job description basically looks like no different, in a human sense, of how this part works on an engine. And both of those models, and the same is true as it evolved into the information age, and both of those models have a core problem for us today, which is that the deviation from optimized is looked at as deviant, or derivation from optimum is looked at as deviant. So when you do exactly what I want you to do, and you do it in a predictable and consistent and ongoing manner, that's great. That's I can now have confidence. But the minute you express yourself in a unique or alternative way, I now have a problem in my perfectly tuned system. And a whole bunch of that carries over from how schools are run to how companies are run and all of this. And this is going to create a problem because all of that creates is more noise, more sameness, more automatons. And I know there's lots of people who go culture, and we try to be different here. And we don't mind if you have a tattoo and an earring at our company. On the flip side of the coin, I think one of the ongoing challenges is that that's where most of us grew up, and we have trouble getting away and expressing that inner art.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I reflect back, I basically never really liked the rules, but I did something that's really kind of interesting. I always learned them, I embraced them, and I somehow developed the ability to navigate them. So if it was important to follow the rules, I did. And when it wasn't, I didn't. And I've somehow cultivated in myself the ability to just kind of plug out, move, and then, this is the way it works. And with kind of a mind of a sociologist, it's fascinating to look at. But, what kind of triggered as you and I were chatting about this thing is this interesting continued interplay and struggle. So we go and we look at engagement studies, and by all accounts, most workforces currently are disengaged. Some are actively disengaged. Okay, well, so you and I look at connectedness. I look at value in communication, and quite frankly, you do too. Well, so go look at those organizations. What's their sense of purpose? Yeah, they're not really sure. What's their sense of belonging? Yeah, they're not really sure. Do they have a voice in the process? No.
Yep.
If they do, it's just because someone told them they did. But the first person who speaks up gets fired, so congratulations, there's your voice in the process.
Yep.
Because as you've pointed out, we want conformity. So what makes me different, especially in the security world, is I'm a very vocal advocate for, what if people didn't conform? What if they were right and we weren't? But there were still things they needed to know. How does that conversation shift? What would we share that would help them in their context? So, what's interesting is that as we're moving to a place where content is not only abundant, it's maybe overabundant. The content now is less important. The context is what's more important. And in my experience, maybe yours is different. I find context is a uniquely different order of thinking and acting than the content.
Well,
Tell you something.
it is by definition. It's funny. I just wrote part of a blog post about that this morning. It is by definition relational, and when I say relational, ultimately I always encourage people to start with the who. But even if you're just talking about ideas, we take the who's out of it. What you're talking about is the context. Always by definition means it relates to something which is a point of reference. And the problem is if just publishing content just contributes to the noise, and the best way for me to be most interesting to you is when it is most contextual or most appropriate to the context that you have, which gets back to one of the challenges and one of those other tensions, which is one versus many. Right? For all of the places that the research in higher education disagree, the one thing that everybody agrees on is that the best way to teach someone is one-on-one. Right? It's why we complain about class sizes in our schools. Well, we get that instinctively. The challenge is the bigger it gets, the more scale you have, the less contextual it is. Because the best way to contextualize it is one-on-one in a conversation. Now, that's not right or wrong. It's a tension that we've got to deal with. But to your point, if I'm going to create content, probably the best thing I can do moving forward is to get really clear on what is the context, which at the end of the day means I have to answer the question, who?
Yeah, and that's going to come back around to value, because the value of what you're sharing has to be in a context that person also values, right?
Right. Well, which back to some of the 4 rights in marketing: right person, right time, right audience, right time, right message, right medium.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So it's the 5th right. But what's interesting, in fact, I'm digging this. So I've started working on a concept. When people contact me and say, "You're a writer, you're a speaker, can you create content for us?" I try really hard not to pop the balloons, and I say yes, but, or yes and, right? More improv. Yes and I ask, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Oh, we want more content because then people will understand what we're doing. I go, no, what you want is context. Look, I'll tell you what if we did this? What if we created content? In fact, it has 3 parts when I look at it. There's what we call the on-ramp, there's the shared journey, and then there's an off-ramp. So if you think of it as moving to a different destination, and that destination is where you set that context, there's 2 interesting things that I've found that have happened on that road to context. We end up getting a lot of experience in a very focused area in our lives. So this happens a lot in security. You've done security, you're very focused on security, and you might have spent, like Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours on security. And now you're going to go talk to somebody who's spent maybe a grand total of 30 minutes on security. And you have to somehow figure out how to translate the complexity of what you've done into a mutual understanding. Or even in security, because it's still fairly new. I've spent 10,000 hours and you've spent 10,000 hours. Doesn't mean we have the same frame of reference. So what happens is on the on-ramp, we use traditional marketing types of stuff, short bursts of messages that are highly valued and highly personalized, and there's some stuff we can do ahead of that. But then on the shared journey, the whole goal, in my opinion, is to educate and elevate people into a structured conversation. So what I start looking at is, if we were going to cultivate agency or foster agency in a person to have this conversation, to talk about value, measurement, communication, what would they need to know? But at the same time, can I map out what's valuable for them? Can I map out what's valuable for me? And we look at that overlap. So now we have that shared experience, we have that journey, and then in the off-ramp, we can start to structure the conversation. And so as to some of the things that you've talked about, now I have a starting point and say, okay, well, Roger, let's talk about X. But now we've got not just the shared knowledge and the journey that got us there, but there's some structure to govern. Let's talk about the value of this. Let's talk about how we're going to measure it. Let's talk about how you're communicating that with your team, with your industry, with your clients, or what have you. So what I'm finding is it's a mechanism by which we can take traditional content, use that to get into a place where it's not threatening, but it gets us all on the same page, and then we can structure those one-on-one conversations, because we still want those. But now we're moving from a shared experience. So if we didn't have a previous common context, now we do.
We're still on the same page. I purposefully lead, as you saw on the website today. I purposefully use the terms reach, teach, lead, because that tends to be, those are verbs, and those are the things that we need to do. But they each have mapped to these tensions, right? One is in the marketing sense. I need to reach you, right? Every consultant on the planet goes, how do I find more customers? Or every speaker on the planet, or inside of organizations. I delivered a speech in Boise last fall, and one guy came up to me and said, "Hey, you know what? I got the same problem because I work for a company. I won't name the company that has 50,000 employees, and I got the same problem of getting attention and getting someone to pay attention to my ideas, and et cetera, just inside of this 50,000 person company." Which
there's one interesting point on that. When I go and I work with vendors, they realize externally they should spend money to promulgate that connection. But when you ask them about how they're doing on their internal alignment, they don't spend any money on it whatsoever. When you go into the enterprises, even if they got 50,000 people, and you ask, what are you doing on that? Again, go look at their budget, their external budget as an enterprise for how they're communicating outward in their customer base. It's very big. They'll pay for the best consultants. They'll do all sorts of stuff. Internally, we let it go, and I think a lot of organizations are missing a lot. That's what part of the reason we have a lot of friction. Just as a quick side point, when I talk about friction in communication, it's the same things you and I keep talking about. So let's be clear: it's not just the delivery; it's also the substance. So a lot of times, if we don't have something of value, or we don't identify it, we don't distill to it, we don't deliver that value, and we're not delivering it in the right way, then those two combine to create the friction. So the way to improve it isn't just to communicate more. And by the way, as a side of pet peeve, people for years have said, "Oh, the answer is effective communication." But if you ask them what that meant, it was like trying to catch water in your hands. It didn't matter. Well, now because they figured out that didn't work, now what they do is they say, "Oh, well, good people over communicate." And I cringe, because if you're communicating in a way that's increasing friction and disconnecting people from value, over communication doesn't solve that. It just exacerbates it. And so part of this quest for agency, on my perspective, is if we can start to, I know the word's overused, but if we can empower individuals, if we can foster that sense of agency, then we can start to align our organizations. As we start to do that, we can have these conversations where the way I look at it is that structure gives you the ability to govern or conform when you need to, and then agency when you don't. So you can go back to being an artist and enjoy your craft, but yet you still know how to connect what you're doing to somebody else. So because they've figured out their value, they can honor yours.
Yeah. One of the things that you said just a moment ago, when we're talking about inside of the organization, makes me think of why organizations are struggling with unified communications. Because I have a new set of tools, in fact, we used to joke about this, because when I left Microsoft and we started a company, we got paid by, Microsoft became one of our two biggest clients, and they'd pay us to go in and roll out, at the time, Microsoft Live Meeting inside of an organization. The thing that doesn't work is just everybody getting an email from IT going, here's your new password and your access to your license, right? And because people don't need more noise. And until I understand the context in a human level of what all of these tools are, not looking at unified communications tools, for those of you who may not know unified communications, that's That's your computer, that's your web, that's instant messaging, that's your mobile phone, that's, at the next level, the ability for you to, your Microsoft Outlook to sense that you're out of the office, and your default rule is that if you're out of the office, it forwards your desk phone to your mobile phone, or being able to, all that kind of stuff. The challenge is when we focus on tools, we start to think of rules. And when we focus on people and community and context, we can start to take a step back and go, I think that makes sense, right? It's about my phone finding me, or your phone call finding me wherever I happen to be, not how do I use unified communications or instant messenger or Yammer or that kind of thing, right? If I have to stop and think about why I would send you an instant message via Microsoft Messenger versus use Yammer to promulgate a semi-synchronous threaded chat, versus when I fire up web conferencing live meeting or GoToMeeting or whatever and have a live video chat, versus if I have to stop and think about it like that, I'm going to get so buried in rules that are so Boolean, if this, then that, except on the third Wednesday of the month when there's a naked midget dancing in the backyard. You're just never gonna make it if it's about tools and rules. My humble opinion.
No, I mean, and I think a lot of that's because one of the things I'm fond of saying, and it's not always the nicest thing, but a lot of times the technology will say, "Oh, I can't explain that to you," and the implication is, you just wouldn't understand. But the reality of it is, take it at face value. I can't explain that to you. I mean, look at passwords, right? We do password resets now are almost a daily habit, or at least it should be. But go to most security people and ask them how a password works. Ask them how functionally a password works. Good luck getting the right answer. Now, ask them if they could explain that to a group of people that have no security background and no technology background, and give them 15 minutes to do it, and have people not come away shaking their heads or lighting pitchforks and ready to take them out. And it's a really interesting challenge. And so what happens a lot of times is that we've created these rules to try to subvert the ability to actually explain the context and the story. Why do we need these tools?
Yep.
Because, I mean, it's interesting. As soon as you mentioned, if I'm out of the office, forward these things here and forward my calls here, and my first question was, do I even want somebody to do that? Right? I mean, I think it's a valid question, because we always assume just because I have the tool, I should do it. I happily turn off my phone all the time. People are like, I called you. I'm like, did I answer? Like, no. I go, I guess I wasn't available, but I called. Congratulations.
Yeah.
You left a message, or you sent an email, or then you followed up with an email, an SMS chat message. You hit me on Twitter. You sent me a note on Facebook. I got you were trying to get in touch with me.
Yeah. Well, and even your very response there is, just because I can, should I? Which gets back to purpose and intent, because, and here's one of the points of pressure that I want to put on every manufacturer of hardware, software, networking tools, whatever, apps, whatever, which is to continue to drive toward, give him a compliment, toward one of the things that was important to Steve Jobs, which is that whole user experience. Right? Because if Michael decides I do or don't want to have a set of rules for how I route email versus voice and that kind of thing, I do or I don't want it to see that Outlook says I'm out of the office and therefore automatically forwards it to my cell phone, I first should think about that in the context of my life, and then if I'm going to go do it, it should not take rocket science or programming to make it happen. Right? I mean, eons ago, this is a slightly dated example, but, when it wasn't too many OSs and years ago, when in Windows, you could run a command prompt from the start menu. Right? And being a Mac guy, I'm just like, if somebody actually knows how to run a command prompt, they know how to find it and run it without frickin' being at the start menu. So why don't we get rid of that clutter for the majority of people who don't know what a command prompt is, unless you grew up in the time of Commodore 64s.
Man, you're bringing back some memories, ones I didn't.
So back to reaching, teaching, and leading, and I'm going to use my words, but you said on-ramp and then structuring the conversation, right? So to begin with, we have this balance, and I'm not sure that there's a perfect answer other than finding one's own place in your own story, where I have this need to create something that is interesting so that it becomes attractive to you. It turns your head. For the same reason you put on the power suit at the networking function, me sharing things that are interesting, whether it's posting something on social media or otherwise how I create content that is designed for a particular context, that could turn your head, right? Which is slightly different than me purposefully saying I'm going to market to you and I'm going to go identify a market. I'm only going to write things that I know Michael's going to want to read. Which then gets to, in a sense, teaching, because as Jay Baer puts in his fabulous book, Utility with a Y-O, utility, we're evolving to this place where this integrated work-life thing has evolved to friend-of-mine awareness, right? He talks about we used to be top-of-mind awareness, and we had to make 7 or 9 phone calls before we would get a return phone call, right? And the only answer in that world is more and bigger and more noise, right? And to... how do I be findable? We'll go from top of mind awareness. How do you remember me? To how am I findable when you are searching for something? Frame of mind awareness is what he calls it. To friend of mind awareness, where in fact my messages are not discreetly part of your business life or your work life. I may be right alongside a whole bunch of other things, including your grandmother and your Facebook stream. And which to me gets back to okay, so how then am I most useful? How am I going to create that stickiness? And to me, that's structured, to use your word, whether it's how do I impart information to you that is useful, or is in a manner that is, I just use the term useful or utility because you're going to go, that was interesting, but more importantly, I'm going to come back to that because that was useful. And then finally, directional. As in, okay, that's where we're at now, but where are we going? Because if you don't have any followers, not a big fan of the word like you are or are not, but if you don't have any followers, you're not a leader. But vision is saying not just where am I at with point A, but where is point B and how are we going to get there? And inevitably somebody's going to go, I like the way Michael sees the world. And I will pay more attention, if not follow you, and therefore you have influenced me by virtue of you being interesting, useful, and directional.
Yeah, and listening to you talk about it, what I'm finding interesting is that we talk about utility, which to me is kind of like value plus, right? It's not just that was valuable, it's valuable and it's timely, or there's some other mechanism to it that makes it accessible or actionable. And what I've started to notice, at least in my own writing, is that in the last maybe 6 or 8 months, I've kind of found my own voice. Like I stopped trying to be somebody else. So go back to the art, and two somewhat related thoughts. The first of the thoughts is we probably both know a bunch of stand-up comics, some perhaps in common. But one of the things is if they do a joke and it bombs, a lot of times they'll peer into the mic and they'll go, "That's okay. I just do that one for me." Right, and it's but it's like, what? There's a lot of value in that. Sometimes you just write something because it feels good, or you craft whatever your craft is because you can, because it feels good, because it was okay, and there's merit in that. And so if you use that to start to liberate your own authenticity, then you can provide things that are of value. But then what I've noticed is 2 things. One, I always try to incorporate a story, and I've taken a much more conversational tone. What I've also noticed in my own, but everybody has their own, what works for them, I'm very interested, because I'm interested in agency, I'm pretty interested in not saying, Roger, this is the how to do it, this is what you do. I'm much more excited to say, hey, you know what, I've noticed this trend, let me backstop that, let me tell you what I think it means, let me give you some ways you can go test it out for yourself, and then, by the way, let's have that conversation. Here's the neighborhoods I hang out in, find me in the one that you like, and let me know how it goes. And I've gotten good responses from that.
Well, I love it, but I'll tell you, and I'm wrestling with the same thing. And so let me ask you a question. Hit the tennis ball back in your court. One of the things that I observed a long time ago, and this frankly could be sound a little bit. I'll just state it's my bias, is that many or most people struggle with the idea of taking a principle and deriving their own personal application. Now, story is great because it helps illuminate context, right? There's a who, there's a journey, there's a transformation from point A to point B, whatever resolution to conflict, whatever that happens to be. But years ago, I actually transformed as I was finding my presentation voice, and especially since I do a lot of high content stuff, with being very propositional. Do this, do this, do this, do this. Because people would go, wait a minute, you just gave me this principle, but what am I supposed to do? A variation of that is one of the most frequent questions I ever get is, hey, what's the best web conferencing planet on software on the planet? Or what's your favorite? And my response for years has been, my favorite one is the one that I'm getting paid to use. And so I have been highly prescriptive, largely, and maybe this is just part of the nature of the audience that I have largely spoken to or attracted, as the case may be. Probably a chicken or the egg part of that question there. But I myself am moving back toward story, anecdote, metaphor, illustration, in part because a lot of these things just frankly cannot be wrestled to the ground.
So, two thoughts. Here's the first one, and I love the way that you open us up. One of the things that I find is when I ask people to define a story, there's a lot of uncomfortable silence, and then somebody usually chirps in beginning, middle, and end.
Yep. Congratulations! You just joined Aristotle. Keep going.
And what I try to do is I just remind people, as you just did, there's characters, there's conflict and resolution. If you don't like the word conflict, you can call it journey or whatever, but there's a transformation that people go through. And what happens then is that there's a distinction between telling a story that has an emotional component to it and that has that transformation and giving me a chronological listing of facts. And at least in a technology world, we tend toward that a lot, and that's going to transfer over no matter where we're using the medium. But there's something that's interesting. I am prescriptive in a lot of my training, but there's a caveat to it. So what I've struggled with is this concept of structure and agency, because typically structure supplants agency. Structure, right, which we've been talking about. I want you to conform. I want you to do this and therefore. And what I've started to realize is that if we do it differently, structure gives you the taste of agency, and then you can actually use structure to cultivate your agency. So if we think about just basic communication stuff, I've got a 5-part framework to help people start to connect value to other people. All right, so I have to say, you do this, and then you do this, and you do this. As you get better at it, you start to realize, well, actually, I don't have to do it exactly that way, but I have to reach those points. And then I've got some folks I've worked with for years that, quite frankly, it's just in their head now. They don't really go through any set process or follow any steps. They've cultivated some level of agency. But the minute they go back and talk to somebody who's at a different part of their journey, they can use that structure in common in order to get where they need to be. So when I'm writing for my columns or something, I'm limited to 800, 900 words. And I don't want to try to be overly prescriptive. That said, I do say, do this or do this or do this, but I don't have the time to set the context or to let them experience what that looks like or where it goes. So it's, I'm glad you pointed out, because there's an interesting balance. There's times when you just want to encourage agency and say, here, go experiment for yourself and let me know how it goes. And hopefully we're not creating anything that's harmful. But when we want people to actually change their behavior patterns or experience something that shifts them, I think we have to be prescriptive, as long as we start with, in my opinion, I'm going to be prescriptive with you, and there's going to come a time where you're going to realize that you didn't need my prescription, and I'm okay with that. And that's a weird twist for a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, did you ever read any of Chip and Dan Heath's works? Right? So the whole elephant and rider thing. If you're listening to this podcast, videocast, whatever, go look up Chip and Dan Heath and just Google elephant and rider, and you'll figure out where that comes from. I agree, and to me, in a sense, it's not wrong, right? I think some of us are born left-handed and right-handed. Some of us are born more creative, and some more strategic, and some more relational, whatever. On the flip side of the coin, and I like the way that you use the word agency, because there is a core of how all of us are wired, right? So one of my hot topics is about dealing with simplicity and complexity and turning it into story. And simplicity and complexity, they're not antithetical, right? Simplicity is not the antithesis of complexity; it's an expression of it. But I spent a lot of time teaching design, PowerPoint design for non-designers for attention and impact, because anybody can learn some principles and design PowerPoint that is more appealing, more impactful, and supports how you're going to deliver a message.
He supports. But let me cut you off because I want to ask you a question now. So I like transforming or translating, or I use the word translating complexity into understanding. And I did that intentionally. I wanted to escape the word simplicity. I love it, but sometimes people equate simple with easy. And unless your experience is different than mine,
or they equate simplicity with being simplistic.
Correct.
Very different.
And so I started just saying to understanding, and I talk about making it accessible. I mean, am I doing a disservice? Should we focus more on simplicity?
No, actually, I get to the same thing even if I'm not using that word. I may rip that off from you. Well, and I'll tell you why. Because, but it always understanding. If you think of the DIKY, data, information, knowledge, wisdom, if not decision making as a next step there. One of the things that I point out to them at that point in time is that as we go from data to information to knowledge, to wisdom, ability to make decisions, we always introduce a who into the discussion, right? We can talk about data and then structuring it or filtering it or doing something in some way or creating some context, which now becomes information, but it really still doesn't become knowledge and understanding and wisdom and actionable until we introduce a who. So you used the term understanding. I tend to draw that out a little differently, but at the end of the day, that's the problem, right? Which is I need to figure out who I'm speaking to if I'm going to simplify this. Now you can do that without per se identifying some of the specificities around the who, right? But an example that I use as a simplicity being an expression of complexity is that of an academic paper. They all open up with an abstract or a summary that in one paragraph tells you what the study was about and what came out of it and what they concluded. And then 15 pages later of statistics and whatever, that you've got the extra stuff. I said, so this isn't a right or wrong, it's a different expression of what that is. And that's why I said I like the way you talk about understanding, because at some point you're communicating it in a manner that makes it understandable. But you're not being unfaithful to the complexity. And I'm sure you've experienced this, but when I've done this with a lot of engineers, and I've done this with a lot of engineers, is somehow they've got this struggle with, I need to make a presentation to the VP who my boss reports to, or the board. I need to boil it down. I need to make it simple. And at the same time, they're wrestling with one of two things. But I need to have everybody understand how complex this is and how smart I am for being able to figure it out. And maybe I'm going to look stupid if I have simplified it. Or there are a lot of contextual if-then things, right? And which gets us to the whole mixed audience, very, very, very frequent. Oh, so now what do I do when I got a mixed audience? And I got the financial people in the room, and I got the techie people in the room, and I got the end users in the room, and now what do I do? That comes up in every situation, for which there isn't an answer. I'm like, you can either do it at a level that's universal to all of them, or you can choose little jumping off points where you're going to explain it from a financial perspective, a technical perspective, a usability perspective.
Let me offer a different perspective on that, because I do deal with that a lot. And one of the questions I get frequently is, Michael, if we give you a mixed audience, how would you possibly handle that? And oddly enough, the answer for me comes back to, there's a story, but now I'm not going to tell you my story. I need to do a little bit of work with you, and I'm going to go figure out your story, because there is something that happened in the organization that ties those groups together, and it's exactly what you just said. I'm going to give you a little bits of those different perspectives, but by using that fairly universal story and being able to tell it back, including the actual elements of story. This was the emotion. This is what was going on. This is the context. What are we going to do about it? And people start to go through that. You watch each of the groups kind of nod their heads, and you go, now, I'm not sure if you know what it was like on the technology side. Let me give you a flavor for it. And that's the one time I would be okay with somebody putting up a really, what I would call, ugly PowerPoint slide. It just shows the sheer complexity. Because I'm not trying to do anything other than show you it's really complex and say, they're trying to wrestle with that. Now, let's look at it from here, right? So what you can do is you can ground everybody back to whatever their realities were, give them a glimpse of somebody else's reality, and then come back to the outcome. Because the other thing I always look at is, what's the outcome? Part of the reason I talk about understanding is an outcome. And it gives us an opportunity to figure out if we did the right job in our translation, if we can come to mutual understanding. And where I love stories, and I don't know if anybody else ever used this concept, but I call it story swapping. And I got it just from my kids. I tell them a story, and instinctively, to confirm understanding, they go, oh, is it like the time we? And then they tell me a story. And I got it right. Or, no, okay, when we did that, no, it's more like, right? And then we keep swapping stories back and forth until we get to that place where okay, we got it. Well, you can do that in the business world too. So I can tell that generic story, or not generic, I tell that story of the company. We work through the different pieces, and then when we bring it into those smaller group conversations, those individual conversations, person goes, yeah, but isn't it more like, and you can get back into that. And that's where I get excited about agency, because when we can do that, we can enable those conversations, and that's where we'll get ahead.
Well, it brings up another issue of context, because one of the things that I ask people to wrestle through, because one of my programs in this is actually a full day program, and then we go from constructing of story to design and delivery of story, two day workshop. And so it's different if I'm delivering a TED Talk or I'm making a recommendation where I'm leading everybody to a conclusion. And those are very different than if I'm facilitating learning, right? Remember that the word educe comes from the Latin, education comes from educe, educere, meaning to lead or draw out. Meaning I'm not pounding crap into you, I'm helping draw it out. Which gets back to another kind of process that we're both familiar with, which is gather, analyze, synthesize, right? When I'm getting to that propositional or recommendation level, I'm doing all of the analysis and wrestling through it and coming to a conclusion. Commonly, however, in a learning, which gets us to the downside of rote learning. There's a time, as we were talking about, when you just give somebody the instructions, the recipe, the proposition. But there's a time when I'm reserving some of the analysis or contextualization. I'm giving that back to the learner, because I am going to set things up. I'm going to say, kind of, here are the boundaries. But now, for those of you who are in the room, I want you to go wrestle through this, right? Which is why sometimes learning in a workshop, when you've got permission to take a day away from email and you can do hands-on work with whatever it is that you're wrestling through, now that application, the discussion, the reflection is where you, and this is something we know in the world of adult learning, where you have the ability to apply, to wrestle with it in the context of your pre-existing knowledge, your presuppositions, your beliefs, your values, etc. And Michael's are different than Roger's, are different than the CTO's. And now we can take these data points that we're all talking about today, but I can then wrestle them to the ground in my context, which deepens the learning as opposed to if I just tell you. Now, it's not right or wrong; both have their place. But even the context of whether I'm making a speech or facilitating learning, or I'm just the coach and facilitator, I'm not even doing too much of the talking. I'm actually just drawing it out of you, right? Ideally, coaching an executive mastermind is actually a very collaborative, facilitated experience where I'm not even doing the teaching of Michael. I'm helping Michael drawing it out by just asking you more questions. Oh, Socrates might have been onto something a couple thousand years ago.
And the key then is asking the right questions at the right time and in the right way. And knowing.
So what do you mean by that? Tell me more, Michael.
See? Well done. Look, it's interesting though, and what I'm really heartened by is that, describing that, you just described using structure to foster agency. Now, what I've started to look at then is that, and I love those settings. I do a lot of 2-day trainings like you, and I build a lot of these hands-on. And what I started to realize over the years is that people are really good with it for a period of weeks, but then the brutality of their own schedules and work just starts to beat them down. And so what I started to realize then is that if I introduce that structure the right way, then we can start to do periodic follow-ups, and we can reconnect people back to that structure and let them relive not only some of the previous agency they had, but now they can continue to apply it in small bits. And it allows you to really focus on the development side of it, right? Training is the learning of a new skill, and if we do it, I like it the way you've described it. We're going to draw some stuff out. We're going to create a safe environment. You're going to get your hands on it, which to me means you got to plan to do something with it. You got to set an intention, and then you got to do it. And then I like to be able to review it and use some of that agency to say what worked, what didn't work, and you can do it individually in the group. There's a number of actions to it. Well, then the development says, let's make sure you can implement it. Let's make sure you can understand it. Let's make sure it works in your context consistently, and where it does or doesn't, then we have opportunities. Now, that gets into a whole host of organizational challenges sometimes, but for the organizations that go, oh, cool, so we just bring these guys in and it's all going to be better? Yep. For a while, yeah. And people will tell you when they follow the things that we share with them and they relive those experiences, they get the results that they were looking for. The problem is sometimes it means we have to structurally change how we think about things and how we do stuff, and that sometimes takes a little bit more effort. And that's where I want the stuff that we do with people to be more lasting, because I really want them to individually have that. I don't know about you, but one of the favorite compliments I get working with a group of people is when they come back the next day and say, well, my spouse was real excited you're here. I go, why? I was so much calmer at dinner, and I communicated so much differently with the kids, and it was great. It's like, wow, okay, cool, right? Because it means that they're taking these fundamental concepts and they're applying them more than just in the work environment. It means they're getting back to themselves.
Right.
I like that.
Great. Which is another leftover from, in a sense, the Industrial Revolution, where you check it out. You check your heart and your soul at the door, and you come in and you attach part A to part B for 8 hours, and then you check out, which is probably a good place for us to wrap, given that we're coming up on the hour. Michael, hang out after I stop the recording, and we'll chat for 2 more seconds. But for those of you out there in listener land, one of the places I would love to point you to, and Michael, my final question for you is, assuming people have fallen in love with you as I have and want to connect with you about one of the many things that you've talked about today, how are they going to find you?
Sure. In the neighborhoods, on Twitter, I'm at Catalyst, or they can right now come to securitycatalyst.com. And we'll keep improving that site to get more of this information out there.
Fabulous. For those of you who are intent on being purposeful and ambitious about reaching, teaching, and leading in an authentic and effective way in a digitally extended life, Roger Courville here, over and out. Have a great day.